Hi, and welcome to Sleepy Pedia. I'm Michael, and tonight I'll be your guide through a forgotten piece of history. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories to fall asleep to, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, what city are you listening from, and what time is it right now where you are? Chapter 1: The Song of Return. In the beginning, there is no war cry, no ship's sail catching the wind, no hero gripping a sword. There is only breath, a hush, the quiet before the tale begins. Somewhere along the shores of time, so far, back that the line between memory and myth blurs into mist, a voice called out to the muses. It was not a roar, but a request. A plea, really, to remember, to sing. And so we meet Homer, or the ghost of him, a figure wrapped in questions. More than robes. Did he truly exist? Was he a single man, blind and brilliant, his sight turned inward toward visions others could not see? Or was Homer a name given to many voices, poets and singers, each adding to a story passed from lip to lip like an ember kept alive? In the wind? The ancient world gave few answers, and perhaps that is the point. For Homer is less a person and more a presence. His song survived not because of who he was, but because of what he made. Through his words, a flickering fire is still kept alive, one that warmed the hearts of warriors, kings, slaves, strollers, and strangers alike. His verses do not begin with certainty. They begin with invocation, with surrender, with the humility of a poet who knew that no tale truly belongs to the teller. We imagine him now, perhaps seated beneath a fig tree or standing before a hearth, the soft crackle of flame echoing the rhythm of his speech. Maybe he never lived, or maybe he lives still in every whisper of the Odyssey carried forward through time, a voice unshaken by empire or ruin, a voice that saw forever, even if its source remains unknown. Echoes from the Bronze Age before Odysseus ever lifted a sail, or wept by the sea. There was a world now mostly forgotten, a world of stone palaces, shining cups, and intricate trade, where ships crossed the wine-dark seas not in search of home, but of tin, gold, and purple dye. Aegean kings built halls of frescoed glory. Warriors stood with bronze blades gleaming beneath the sun. And then, as if the gods had drawn a long breath and exhaled ruin, it ended. The Bronze Age collapsed like a wave receding, not all at once, but in slow, echoing silence. Great cities fell, scripts went unread, roads grew wild with grass. The world shrank, trade routes dissolved like salt in rain, and memory began to slip from history into myth. Names like Mycenae, Knossos, and Troy lingered only in the song's distant, glittering images behind veils of smoke. When the Odyssey was born, this old world was already gone, but its bones still lay beneath the stories. The characters in Homer's verse carry bronze swords, eat from golden bowls, and measure their lives by the weight of glory, echoes of an earlier age shining through the veil of time. Yet this is not nostalgia, it is reconstruction. The way we piece together dreams from shards of glass, finding beauty even in brokenness. For those who first listened to the Odyssey, these were more than tales. They were bridges to a time when God still walked the earth, when heroes stood taller, and the world, though broken, was still full of meaning. The poem does not just remember the past, it reimagines it. And in doing so, it makes the vanished World breathe again. The double vision of the Odyssey is not simply a story. It is a mirror and a dream. At once ancient and eternal, it holds a strange kind of double vision. In one eye, it sees the real, the hunger, the grief, the longing for home. In the other, it sees the myth, the lotus eaters, the cyclops, the voice of gods on the wind. And through both, it teaches us how memory itself is shaped through repetition, through rhythm, through wonder. It is a story told aloud again and again across generations. Mothers sang it to sons. Sailors whispered it beneath the stars. Soldiers remembered it before battle. Each retelling changed it slightly, not to betray the tale, but to preserve it. Like water shaping stone, the story found new forms without losing its heart, and what a strange heart it has. Odysseus, its hero, is not simply brave. He is cunning, wounded, stubborn, and deeply human. His journey is not a straight line, but a spiral, one that bends back upon itself, filled with false starts, storms, seductions, and sorrow. He is always arriving and never quite home. The Odyssey teaches us that home is not a place you reach, but a truth you carry or sometimes lose. It is a dream so vivid you forget it's a dream, and when you wake, you are changed. The story flows like a river, winding through past and future, memory and desire, always carrying something deeper beneath its surface. Through this double vision, we are reminded that stories are not only what they say, they are what they mean to those who listen. And in the long hush of night, when all else is quiet, the Odyssey speaks most clearly, not just of where we've been, but of what we hope might still be true. The shape of the story to come at first glance. The Odyssey may seem like a simple tale, a man trying to get home. But beneath that simplicity lies a structure as intricate as a spider's web, delicate, deceptive, and strong. It moves forward and backward through dreams, memories, and riddles. The past is never truly past. The future is seen in visions, and the present feels stretched like twilight, neither fully day nor fully night. The story opens not with Odysseus, but with his son. It begins in absence, in longing, in a question, where is he? And from there, the tale unwinds in waves. We see Odysseus trapped on an island. Then we see how he got there. Then we are pulled even further back, to battles, to choices, to gods in council. Time bends like a bow, its arc held in the hands of the poet, and through it all, patterns emerge, disguises, reunions, hospitality offered, betrayed, reclaimed, fathers and sons, wives and strangers, the old and the young. Each episode is a thread in a larger tapestry, one that mirrors the very act of storytelling itself. Because the Odyssey is not just about returning home. It is about how the journey is told, about how we make sense of chaos through shape, through song, through story. Even its conclusion loops gently into beginning. The end is not an explosion but a hush, a bed recognized, a scar remembered, a peace restored, and then silence again as if the story itself bows and leaves the stage. A journey that belongs to all of us. What makes the Odyssey endure is not its monsters, its gods, or its battles, though these make it vivid. It endures because it speaks to the quiet truths beneath all noise, that we are all, in some way, trying to get home. For the soldier returning from war, it is a tale of wounds that cannot be seen, For the refugee, it is the ache of belonging. For the child watching parents separate, it is the dream of unity. For the lonely, it is the hope that someone still waits with a light in the window. Odysseus is no longer just a king. He is every soul who has been lost, every traveler who has wept by a strange shore, every heart that has remembered a name when all else was forgotten. His cunning is not simply cleverness, it is survival. His grief is not weakness, it is proof of love. And when he finally returns, not with a parade, but with silence and recognition, we too feel a quiet arrival in ourselves. A reminder that though the world may twist, though we may forget who we are for a while, there is always a way back. Not to where we began, but to who we are meant to become. This is why the Odyssey endures, because it does not belong to the past. It belongs to everyone who has ever been broken and still believed in return. And as this story begins, soft as a tide, sure as a star, we prepare ourselves not just for a tale, but for a journey, one that will take us far, and gently, with each word, bring us home. Chapter 2. The Island Without a King. Once, the palace of Ithaca echoed with laughter, footsteps, and the deep voice of a king. But now it sits hushed, a grand shell watching time pass slowly over its stone walls. The columns remain tall, and the sea still sighs just below, but the warmth that once lived in its halls is fading. Dust gathers where warriors once tread. The firelight flickers, but it no longer dances with joy. It clings to the edges of the room like a memory that refuses to be forgotten. In the center of this stillness, Penelope moves like a shadow. She is quiet but not weak, strong but not loud. Her presence holds the palace together. Her hands weave during the day, and at night they undo what was made. A loom sits in her chamber like a secret, each thread a prayer, each pattern a delay. The suitors, loud, proud men from nearby lands, fill the halls with laughter and drink. They come to claim her hand, to take the place of a king whose bones, they believe, are lost beneath the sea. But Penelope does not answer them. She smiles with silence. Her gaze is patient, almost cruel in its calm, for they do not understand that she is not waiting for a man. She is waiting for a truth. Around her, servants whisper. They wonder if Odysseus lives. They wonder if their queen hopes or pretends. The food is served, the beds are cleaned, but the soul of the palace feels like it has drifted elsewhere, perhaps across the waves with the man it once called master. There are echoes in the stairways and corners, the kind only felt by those who remember. And beneath it all, under the stone and song, the island holds its breath, waiting for a king or a storm. The boy and the empty throne in this silence. A boy walks. He is not yet a man, but not quite a child. His name is Telemachus, and the world sees him as the son of Odysseus, though he has never truly heard that voice or felt that hand upon his shoulder. He walks the halls where his father once stood, where tales were once told by the fire. Yet the stories he hears now are not sung in honor, but in doubt. Too long gone, the suitors murmur, clinking their goblets. A ghost clinging to memory, but Telemachus listens. And more than that, he remembers. Not the man himself, but the shape of him. The way the servants speak of him in hushed awe. The way his mother's eyes drift to the door when the wind picks up. Telemachus does not know what it means to lead. His shoulders are not broad enough, his voice not deep enough. But something inside him is beginning to rise, a flame that does not flicker even when ignored. The throne is empty. It watches him. It tests him. He does not speak much. He learns. He watches the suitors, their greed, their arrogance, their laughter that cracks like thunder through quiet rooms. He feels the shame of a house overtaken, of power slipping like sand through fingers. And still he waits. Each morning the sun rises over the cliffs of Ithaca, casting golden light across the marble floor where the throne sits, untouched. Telemachus stands in that light now and then, pretending, perhaps, or hoping. One day the sun will rise and he will be ready. But readiness is not something taught by comfort. It grows in the cracks, in the hunger to know, to become. And deep within him, beneath the still boyish frame and the hesitant gaze, the blood of kings begins to stir, slow and steady like the first breath before a storm. The goddess who walks beside on another morning, as ordinary as the rest, a stranger arrives on the shores of Ithaca, not with noise or fanfare, but as quiet as a breeze through olive trees. She walks in sandals dusty with travel, clothed like a nobleman, wise in the ways of both word and war. None know her truth. None see the light in her eyes for what it truly is. She is Athena, the daughter of Zeus, guardian of wisdom and war, and her step has purpose. She does not shout her mission. Gods rarely do. Her work is not to replace fate, but to shape it gently, to press her hand upon the shoulder of the world and nudge it into motion. She comes for Telemachus, not to make him great, but to remind him that greatness is already in him, waiting. In the form of the nobleman Mentes, she speaks to him plainly, but with a gravity that only the soul understands. Your father, she says, was no common man. He may yet live. But even if he is gone, his spirit remains. And what will you do, Telemachus, with that blood in your veins? The boy listens, not with his ears alone, but with something older, something that aches to be called into life. Her words do not promise certainty. Instead, they plant something deeper, courage. The courage not just to hope, but to act, to stop waiting and start becoming. She tells him to gather men, to ready a ship, to seek answers from the mouths of those who knew Odysseus best. And with each word, the air shifts. The halls of the palace seem less heavy, the sea less still. She departs as softly as she came, leaving behind no mark except the change in a single boy. And yet that is enough, for the gods need only one thread to shift the fabric of the world. And now Telemachus holds it. The first step of a sun, that night, the sky over Ithaca is clear. The stars blink down like watchful eyes, ancient and steady. And Telemachus, for the first time, does not dream of waiting. He dreams of sails in distant lands, of answers hidden in the voices of kings and travelers. The next morning, he stands by the harbor, the sea before him no longer a wall, but a road. A ship is summoned, not a grand vessel, but swift and ready. The crew, quiet men who still remember the name of Odysseus with respect, agree to sail. Word spreads through the palace, through the island, like a song long unsung. Penelope hears it. Her hands pause at the loom. She says nothing, but her eyes grow soft, not with fear, but with recognition. Her son is leaving. Not as a boy, not anymore. Telemachus steps onto the ship as the sun rises, casting golden fire across the waves. His hand rests on the wooden rail. His jaw is tight. He does not yet know what lies ahead: danger, disappointment, or perhaps nothing at all. But he knows this: he cannot wait forever. A life lived in waiting is not a life, only a shadow of one dot as the ship pulls away from the shore. The island watches. The palace stands silent. And somewhere beyond the blue horizon, fate begins to stir. The sea does not roar. It cradles. The wind does not rush. It guides. For though he sails to find his father, what Telemachus will discover is far greater: the truth of who he is, and who he is meant to become. And in the sky above, Athena watches, not with worry, but with pride. The boy has taken his first step. The journey has begun. Chapter 3. Voices from the War. The sea glowed faintly beneath the rising sun, its color a soft mirror of the sky, peach, silver, and gold. Telemachus stood at the bow of the ship, watching the waves break gently beneath him. He had left Ithaca behind, but he had not yet found what he was looking for. In truth, he didn't know exactly what that was: a name, a face, a story, a spark. Something that would connect him to the man he had only ever known in whispers. And now, as the shores of Pylos drew near, the wind shifted as if even the air knew he was entering sacred memory. The halls of Nestor stood proud and open, kissed by firelight and history. They were not rich in gold, but rich in story, and here, story mattered more than treasure. The old king received him with warmth that did not need proof of identity. There was no test, no suspicion. Only a welcome, as if Nestor had been waiting for this boy to come and sit beside his hearth. The flames danced in the great hall as the evening stretched on. Telemachus listened, and he listened deeply. Nestor's voice was strong, his eyes ancient with memory. He spoke of battles not just fought with spears, but with wit, of plans that saved lives, of words spoken in shadows, of the strange and brilliant ways Odysseus had shaped the course of a war that could have devoured the world. For the first time, Telemachus saw his father not as a statue of legend, but as a man who had once stood beside other men, who had wept, who had waited, who had chosen wisely even when it cost him. There was grief in Nestor's voice, but pride too, and in those stories, something stirred in the young listener. Telemachus found in them a mirror, not of what he was, but of what he might become. The courage was not in the sword, but in the choices. That night, sleep came softly, with the scent of smoke and salt still on his skin. And as his eyes closed, Telemachus no longer felt small. He felt part of something. He felt the first ember of legacy warm in his chest. The king and queen of Sparta rose like a vision out of time. The marble gleamed beneath the sun. The gates opened not with formality, but with a strange reverence. For here lived the names that had shaped the the world. Menelaus, king of war, returned, and Helen, the woman whose face, they said, had launched 1,000 ships. Telemachus stepped into their palace not as a boy seeking his father, but as a guest of a story much larger than himself. Menelaus was older now, his voice calm, his manner quieter than one might expect from a man who had survived 10 years of war and another 10 of trying to find meaning in peace. His eyes, sharp and searching, seemed to see beyond Telemachus's youth. And yet, it was Helen who held the room like still water, beautiful, yes, but with a sadness that softened her presence into something unforgettable. They dined not with fanfare, but with conversation. And as wine flowed and lamps flickered, the stories began. Menelaus spoke of the final days of Troy, of ashes, of betrayals, of the long road home. And Helen, her voice like the wind in a curtain, spoke too, of longing, of guilt, of choices made in moments that stretched forever. In consequence, there was no vanity in her, only remembrance. They spoke of Odysseus not as a warrior alone, but as a mind like no other, a man who saw the world in riddles, who could shape fate with words and silence alike. His tricks, his disguises, his patience. They had all saved lives, ended sieges, made peace when bloodlust would have won. And they spoke of his heart, that he had longed for Ithaca every day, even as he played the part fate demanded. In this palace of light and shadow, Telemachus came to understand that the war had never truly ended. It lingered in voices, in scars, in the air itself. It had changed his father, it had changed them all. But still, Odysseus had not surrendered to it. That mattered. And as he walked through the colonnades that night, beneath a moon cradled by clouds, Telemachus realized he was not just chasing a man. He was chasing the meaning of survival, the dignity of return, the strength to carry memory without letting it crush you. What the sea god saw, the waves rolled endlessly, and time seemed to stretch with them. But finally, from the lips of Menelaus, carried by the tale of a god himself, came the news Telemachus had longed to hear. Odysseus was alive. Menelaus had wrestled Proteus, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, and in that struggle had wrung truth from water. Proteus had spoken of Odysseus not in death, but in waiting. He was held on an island, far from home, bound by circumstance, not will. He had not perished in the storm, nor vanished into legend. He lived, and he remembered. The words struck Telemachus, not like a shout, but like a deep chord. They didn't lift him into wild joy. Instead, they sank into him like warmth into winter skin. His father lived. The story was not finished. The thread still ran between them, stretched thin but unbroken. There was power in knowing. Even if the road ahead was still unknown, the path existed. The voice of the sea had confirmed what the heart had hoped, that not all who are lost are gone, that not all silence is absence. That hope, when held long enough, can find its way back through the fog. Telemachus stood beside the harbor that evening, watching the sea foam against the rocks. The wind had changed. The sky seemed clearer. And though no sails yet rose on the horizon, he felt something rise within him. A tide, a promise, a belief renewed. The return of the sun. The ship creaked gently as it sliced through the water, carrying him homeward. But Telemachus was no longer the same. The boy who had stood in Ithaca's halls, overshadowed by ghosts and mocked by strangers, had grown in ways that could not be seen on the skin. His shoulders were still lean, his hands still unscarred. But within, something had shifted. He had spoken with kings. He had heard God's whispers. He had seen the weight of war in old eyes and the resilience of love in quiet hearts. And he had found pieces of his father scattered across the world, not in relics or bones, but in the stories, the choices, the consequences that lingered. Long after battles were done, Ithaca was still the same when it came into view, its cliffs rising quietly, its trees bending softly in the breeze. But Telemachus saw it differently now. He saw not just what it was, but what it could be. Not just what it had lost, but what it still held. He stepped off the boat not as a boy coming back, but as a young man returning to take up a place he had once been unsure was his. The throne was still empty. The suitors still feasted. The future still hung in the balance. But now, Telemachus no longer waited for someone else to act. He had begun his own journey, and in doing so had become part of the story, not just its echo. That night, as he passed once more through the silent halls of his home, he paused by the great door. The same door his father had once opened. The same door he hoped would open. Again, he did not speak. He did not weep. He simply placed his hand on the wood, firm and quiet, like a vow made in darkness and far across the sea, on an island surrounded by endless blue. A man stirred in his sleep, as if he had felt, even in dreams, the first soft return of his son. Chapter 4. A Kingdom of Thieves. The sun rose each morning over Ithaca, casting its light upon tiled roofs and olive trees, but inside the palace the warmth did not reach. What had once been a home, a place of laughter, command, and ceremony, had become a hollow stage, its grandeur stolen by the arrogance of uninvited men. They came dressed in silk and gold, but there was nothing noble about them. They were guests turned invaders, and they had made their kingdom from another man's absence. The halls echoed with their voices, too loud, too careless. The scent of roasted meat, of spilled wine and ripe fruit filled the air from morning. Tonight, tables sagged under the weight of gluttony. Servants, once proud, now moved in silence with downcast eyes. The suitors had taken everything, not by sword, but by staying. And still, they wanted more. More food, more song, more time, more control. Each demand chipped away at the dignity of Ithaca like salt air upon stone. They sat where they had no right to sit. They drank from the goblets of kings. They boasted of their bloodlines, laughed at one another's crude tales, and competed not in honor, but in who could shout the loudest. Yet beneath their laughter, there was something rotten, a nervousness they dared not name. For they lived in a house whose master was not yet declared dead, and deep down, even they felt it. The quiet warning stitched into the walls. The presence not yet past. Each day they mocked Telemachus with their eyes, pretending he was not growing, pretending he was still a boy. And each day he watched them more carefully, his silence slowly sharpening into resolve. But they didn't see that. They were too full of themselves, too certain the storm had passed, unaware that the sky can seem clear even moments before. The thunder returns. They ate, they drank, they demanded songs about the past, but the past was not finished with them. And every bite they took from the feast they didn't earn was another step closer to the reckoning they could not yet imagine. The queen, who refused to break in the quiet room behind the great hall, where the noise of the suitors faded to a dull hum. Penelope sat at her loom. The warp and weft stretched out before her like a field waiting for seeds. And into it she placed her strength, not with the force of warriors, but with the patience of one who knows that waiting is its own kind of war. By day, she wove. Her fingers moved with grace, her mind steady, her face unreadable. She told the suitors she was preparing a funeral shroud for Laertes, her husband's aging father. It would be wrong, she said, to wed again while her father-in-law remained without honor. The suitors nodded, they praised her devotion, and they waited. But By night, in the silence when the torches dimmed and the palace finally exhaled, Penelope would return to her loom. Alone beneath a single lamp, she would undo what she had done. Thread by thread, she would unweave the day's work. Not because she doubted the fabric, but because she had no intention of ever finishing it. This, then, was her resistance. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and exact. A refusal to let time win. A refusal to let them have what they wanted. She could not fight them with weapons, but she could hold them off with thread and wit. She could stretch the days like yarn on a spool, binding the future until the winds turned dot. In this, Penelope became more than queen. She became the anchor of Ithaca, the single thread keeping it from unraveling. Where others might have collapsed, she endured. Where others shouted, she watched. And behind her calm eyes, there flickered a knowledge the suitors did not understand, that not all power is loud, and not all battles are won in the open. She had no certainty. She had only her loom, her silence, and her hope. But that was enough. Sometimes the strongest shield is the will not to break. Dreams that speak truths in the stillness of the night. When the palace fell quiet and the drunken echoes of the suitors faded into darkness, Penelope closed her eyes. Sleep came to her like a cautious visitor, gently, with a touch of hesitance. And in that sleep, she walked through a world stranger. Then waking, yet somehow more honest, she dreamt not of comfort, but of wings. In one vision, an eagle flew down from the sky and struck a flock of geese feeding by her fountain. Blood stained the marble, feathers scattered in the wind. She gasped, and yet felt no fear, for when she turned to speak of it, a voice told her plainly. The eagle was her husband, and the suitors were the birds dot in another dream. She stood beside the sea, waves pulling at her robe, and saw a ship sailing through mist, no crew aboard. Only a single name spoken by the wind. The name rang out like a bell, Odysseus. These dreams did not comfort her, but they steadied her. They reminded her that what is unseen is not always lost, that fate moves not in straight lines, but in spirals and signs. The gods speak softly, especially to those who suffer without complaint. She never spoke of these dreams, not to the servants, not to Telemachus, not to the women who whispered in her chambers. But each morning, when she rose, she did so with a deeper calm, as if she were not waiting in the dark, but listening, for steps, for sails, for the sound of a door opening that had remained closed for too long. The dreams gave her nothing concrete, only symbols. But in a world where truth was often hidden, even symbols could light the way. She did not need certainty. She only needed reminders that some things return, that some names are never truly gone, the whisper of a name far across. The sea, on a distant island kissed by salt and solitude, a man stirred beneath the open sky. His back bore the weight of years spent surviving, not in glory, but in silence. His hands were still strong, but his heart bore more scars than his skin. And though he lived in the home of a goddess with food and comfort at hand, he was not whole. Odysseus sat on the shoreline, as he did each day, staring at the horizon. The waves whispered as they touched the sand, and sometimes, if he listened closely enough, he could almost hear his name carried in their rhythm. He had not forgotten who he was, but he had buried it. Because remembering brought pain. Because hope, when held too tightly, can become a blade. Yet now something had shifted, a whisper, small but clear. a memory rising like dawn, a sense that the world had turned again and that he was once more being called. The gods knew it. The winds felt it. Even the stars seemed to align just slightly, differently. He would not remain here much longer, not because he was cast out, but because it was time. In Ithaca, his name passed between lips again, not shouted, but spoken in secret, among servants, among strangers, among suitors who suddenly feared the sound of it. They laughed to cover it, but the seed had been planted, that he might return, that the dead king was not dead, that the feast might end in silence, and Penelope, in her quiet war, felt it too. The thread beneath her loom tightened slightly. The air shifted. The dreams deepened. Odysseus, not as a myth, not as a hope, but as a man walking once more toward his story, slowly, quietly, and soon. For what is taken must be returned. What is broken must be answered. And names, when whispered long enough, find their way home. Chapter 5. The Island of Longing. There are islands that offer safety, and there are islands that hold you too gently until even the softest touch becomes a cage. The one Odysseus called home for 7 long years was not barren nor cruel, quite the opposite. It was a paradise carved out of myth, wrapped in green and gold, where no one grew old and the seasons never changed. But the beauty of it, unending and untouchable, was its heaviest chain. Calypso's island was made of dreams, not his, but hers. Tall trees whispered in breezeless air. Vines burst with flowers that never wilted. Birds sang songs with no sorrow, and fruits hung low, always ripe, never falling. There was no hunger, no death, no fear. Yet there was also no beginning, no middle, no end. Time curled into itself and fell asleep. She loved him. That much was true. The goddess with the hair of sunlight and the voice of water had taken him in when the sea had thrown him down. She tended his wounds, gave him comfort, held him in the night. But her love, for all its warmth, asked one thing in return: for him to forget the war, to forget the journey, to forget his name as husband, father, and king, to become not a man, but a memory folded into a perfect place. She offered him immortality. She offered him eternity, a life with no pain, no fear. Just her, this island, and forever. But Odysseus was not a man made for stillness. His soul, like his story, was shaped by movement, by longing, by return. He smiled at Calypso with kindness, touched her hand without cruelty. But each time he looked out to sea, something inside him pulled, not out of hate, not even out of sorrow, but out of the quiet truth that even paradise becomes prison when it does not belong to you. For all its perfection, the island did not speak his language. It held no voice of his mother, no laughter of his son, no scent of his olive tree or creak of his own bed. It was beauty that did not carry his memory, a home built for someone else's dream. And so, even as the sun shone every morning, Odysseus awoke to the same ache. The island stayed the same, but inside him the longing grew. The tears of a king each day, as morning spilled golden light over the hills, Odysseus walked to the same small ledge overlooking the endless sea. It was not high or dramatic, just a quiet place where stone met sky. And there he sat, not as a hero, not as a king, but as a man, weary, watchful, waiting. He did not scream. He did not pound his fists against the earth. He simply wept out, not the wild weeping of a man who had lost all hope, but the slow, steady kind, like rain that falls even when the sun still shines. His tears ran without shame. They traced the same paths down his face day after day, as if marking time in saltwater dot, and what he saw as he wept was not the sea before him, but the land beyond it, Ithaca, the island that lived inside him. Its smell, its dust, its crooked hills and winding roads. He saw Penelope, not as a fantasy but as a presence, her hand steady at the loom, her eyes watching the door. He saw Telemachus, no longer a child but still his child. He saw the trees he had planted, the fields he had walked, the dogs he had trained. These memories were not visions. They were roots. He cried because he remembered, and because remembering meant he could not surrender. Some nights, Calypso would come and sit beside him. She never asked him to stop. Sometimes she spoke of the stars. Sometimes she said nothing at all. But her silence carried a sorrow of its own, the grief of loving someone who belongs to another place. For Odysseus, the sea became his mirror, and in its reflection, he did not see the immortal life he had been offered. He saw the life he had left behind, imperfect, finite, full of pain and loss and failure. But his, truly his dot, and so the tears continued, not as a weakness, but as a quiet vow that he had not forgotten who he was or where he was meant to return. The messenger with winged feet far above the clouds, beyond the sight of mortals and the reach of kings, Olympus stirred. Even the gods had grown restless. For though Odysseus was a man, his tale had entangled itself in the threads of fate, and fate cannot be paused forever. And so Hermes was sent, the messenger of Zeus, the god with winged sandals and silver words. He descended like a breeze through warm air, not disturbing the leaves, not breaking the silence. Calypso knew he was coming. The air changed before he appeared. The sky blinked out. She met him at the shore. No surprise in her eyes, only sorrow that had learned how to smile. Hermes did not speak with cruelty. His tone was soft, his message simple. Zeus had spoken. Odysseus must be released. His path must continue. The story was not finished. The ocean was waiting. Calypso did not argue. Gods rarely do when fate has spoken. But her heart, immortal though it was, cracked quietly in the places only she could feel. She turned back to her cave, not in anger, but in preparation. She found Odysseus by the sea, as always. And this time, when she sat beside him, she did not speak of staying. She spoke of leaving. She would help him, she said, not because she had to, but because she loved him enough not to keep him. She would give him tools, food, and direction. And she would give him something else, her blessing, the purest thing a broken heart can offer. Odysseus did not gloat. He did not cheer. He simply placed his hand over hers and bowed his head. And in that gesture, a quiet kind of peace passed between them. The kind that exists only when two souls, once joined, part without bitterness. Into the sea again, the raft was not grand. It was made of timber bound by rope, shaped by his hands, guided by her wisdom. It had no sails of silk, no carved lions or dragon heads, no shield-lined rails. It was humble, but it floated. And that was enough. On the morning he left, the sky was still and wide. The island shimmered behind him like a place in a dream, too perfect to be real, too real to be forgotten. Calypso stood at the edge of the shore, her dress fluttering, her face unreadable. She said no final goodbye, only a nod. Only eyes that watched until he disappeared beyond the horizon. Odysseus pushed away from the land, and the raft creaked under his weight. The sea welcomed him not with calm, but with purpose. It rolled beneath him like a living thing, vast, wild, unpredictable. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a wanderer once more. He looked forward, not with certainty, but with will. Each wave carried him farther from the island and closer to the world he had once left behind. He knew the dangers. He knew the gods would not make it easy. The sea was no straight road. It was full of moods, full of power. But he did not flinch that he was not returning for comfort. He was returning for truth, for soil that bore his name, for a wife who waited without knowing why, for a son who might not remember his face but would know his heart. In the eyes of the gods he was small, a single man on a raft of rope and wood. But to the sea and to the story he was something more, a soul in motion, a story that would not surrender, a name that still mattered. And so he drifted forward, wind at his back, heart open, eyes wide. Not home yet, but finally on his way. Chapter 6. The Storm and the Shore. The sea was never silent, but this time it screamed out far from the calm shorelines of paradise. Odysseus drifted, no longer cradled by Calypso's perfect island, but set loose upon the wide mouth of fate. And as his raft creaked beneath the weight of wind and sky, another force awakened. Poseidon, lord of earthquakes, master of oceans, the god who ruled every current and every storm, and who had not forgotten. For years Odysseus had escaped his wrath, hidden away by Calypso's protection. But now, out in the open blue, the king of Ithaca floated vulnerable. No fleet, no oarsman, no anchor, but hope. Poseidon saw him and did not hesitate. Old grudges rise like waves, and this god's rage was deep as the seafloor. He summoned a wind first, not playful, but sharp and sudden, splitting clouds apart with a roar. The sky darkened. The ocean reared up like a beast awakened, salt and foam foaming from its jagged mouth. Thunder cracked overhead like the gods themselves were splitting the sky with axes. The raft buckled. The ropes strained. Water lashed over the sides in cold, punishing fists. Lightning danced across the waves, not as light, but as judgment. Poseidon was not merely angry, he was deliberate. Every wave, every crash was a reminder. You defied me. You blinded my son. You will not reach your home. But Odysseus, still gripping the bindings of his small raft, did not curse the gods. He did not scream into the storm. He knew the sea, knew its cruelty, knew its rules. This was not a war he could win. It was one he could survive, if only just. And as Poseidon drove the storm onward, the man in the center of it all remained unbowed. He was tossed, battered, drowned again and again, but not defeated, because there was something in him the sea could not take, something that had nothing to do with muscle or magic, something older, quieter, stubborn as roots. The man and the beam. The raft broke, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a body giving way to exhaustion. The ropes snapped first, ripped apart by wave and wind. The timbers cracked next, buckling under the weight of the storm's fury. And then, just as the sea seemed ready to pull it all beneath, it shattered, scattering like driftwood across. A darkened world, Odysseus found himself alone in the water, no sail above him, no deck beneath his feet, just the swell of waves and a single broken beam. He clutched it, his fingers white with force, his breath ragged from the salt he swallowed with every crash. Around him, the sea rolled, a living force, pressing, pulling, always pulling. Could have let go. Let the current take him. Let the gods have their due. But he didn't, because even when everything else was stripped away, the armor, the name the legends whispered around fires, he was still a man who remembered home. And in that memory was his anchor. He thought of Telemachus not as a warrior, but as a boy with hopeful eyes. He thought of Penelope, not as a queen, but as a woman sitting in silence, weaving with trembling hands. He thought of Ithaca, not as a throne, but as earth, as stone, as morning light across familiar hills. And so he held on. Wave after wave rose to end him, but he held on. The sea turned cold, but he held on. His muscles screamed, his eyes blurred. His mind slipped toward the edge of forgetting, but still he clung to that beam like it was the last sentence in a fading story. Not just survival, but defiance. Not of the gods, but of despair. The storm raged longer than it should have, but storms always end. And when this one passed, it left behind a sky that blinked open like a tired eye, and beneath it, a man still, breathing, bruised, half drowned, but not broken, because you can take a raft from a man, but you cannot take his direction, the shore of the Phaeacians. The morning came like a secret whispered by the sea. Gentle light pushed through the clouds, brushing the waves with silver and gold. And there, rising from the mist like a promise, was land. At first, Odysseus thought it might be a trick, a vision conjured by exhaustion. But as the sun warmed his skin and the beam beneath him drifted closer, he saw trees, he saw cliffs. He saw earth. The island of Scheria, land of the Phaeacians, a people blessed by the gods, distant from war, untouched by sorrow. And as the waves finally surrendered him to the shallows, Odysseus, naked and scraped raw by rock and salt, crawled onto its shore like a newborn pulled from the womb of the world. He did not rise. Not yet. He lay there, face down in sand and foam, breathing in the scent of soil. It was not Ithaca, but it was land. And that, after so many days of drifting death, was enough. Around him, the beach curved gently. Olive trees swayed in the breeze. A small river trickled beside him, fresh and cold. The sky was open and blue again. No thunder. No wrath. Only the hush that comes after a scream has spent itself. Odysseus crawled beneath the low-hanging branches and let the leaves cover him. He gathered what strength he had, wrapped himself in fallen reeds, and let sleep take him like a kind hand. At last, a sleep not cursed by gods or twisted by dreams. Just rest. Deep, real, healing rest. And in that sleep, for the first time in many days, he did not dream of drowning. He dreamt of a door, wooden, familiar, waiting to be opened. The princess and the stranger she came with laughter before she came with help. Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king, walked the shore with her maids, their arms full of linens, there. Baskets woven with fruits and perfume. They had come to wash, to laugh, to play where the world was still soft and safe. Their songs echoed between trees. Their feet left prints like petals on the sand. Then one of them screamed, and Odysseus, startled awake by the sound, rose from his leafy bed, not as a monster, but as a shadow of what he once was, his body bruised, his eyes sunken, his beard wild and tangled like seaweed. He looked not like a king, but like a creature, yet he stood with dignity. Covered only by branches, he stepped from the trees and did what only a noble man does. He did not beg. He asked, Nausicaa, young but wise, did not flee. She saw past the fear, past the wreck. She saw something old and honorable in his voice, in the way he did not meet her eyes too long, in the way he spoke of grace, of mercy, of home. She listened. And then, with kindness that belonged not just to youth, but to character, she offered him what he had not had in years, shelter. She called her servants. She gave him oil to clean his skin, garments to clothe his form, bread to fill his belly. She did not ask for his name, not yet, because she knew that sometimes names carry too much weight. What matters first is care, and as the sun rose higher over Scheria, a moment unfolded between them, a girl and a stranger, a kindness without condition, a trust without proof. It was not the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of healing. Odysseus had survived the wrath of gods, the teeth of the sea, the ache of longing. And now, on this quiet island, beneath the eyes of a young woman with a heart unclouded by fear, he found what he had not known he needed. Gentleness. It is not always battles that shape heroes. Sometimes it is mercy. Sometimes it is simply a hand that does not let go. And so, beneath the olive trees, the storm behind him and the shore beneath his feet, the man who had no name was given what he had almost forgotten how to ask for, a place to begin again. Chapter 7. A Hall of Gold and Song. Before he stepped across its threshold, Odysseus did not know that such places could exist, not in the waking world. The palace of the Phaeacians rose like a vision summoned by kindness and crowned with peace. Its walls were not simply stone, they shimmered like morning dew on polished bronze. The doors swung open not with groaning hinges, but as if the building itself breathed. It was a place untouched by war, by hunger, by grief. Inside, light moved gently, as if it too had been tamed. Fountains whispered in every corner, fed by silver pipes that never rusted. Columns bloomed like trees. Vines spilled fruit that never spoiled, and the air was sweet with something close to eternity. No dirt clung to the floor. No bitterness hung in the air. Even the shadows seemed warmed out. It was a dream, but not his. Odysseus, barefoot and wrapped in borrowed cloth, stood still for a moment longer than a guest should. He was a man made of edges, a man who had slept on rocks, who had run from storms, who had shouted into wind and silence alike. Now he stood in a world where even the chairs glowed with gold and the walls sang soft with unseen music. The people here, the Phaeacians, knew only joy and welcome. Their hearts were gentle, their faces unlined by fear. They did not know war as he did. They had never felt their homes burn or their children vanish behind the smoke, and yet they welcomed him without question. Not because he was Odysseus, they did not yet know his name, but because he was weary, and he had knocked. King Alcinous sat upon a throne carved of ivory and coral. His queen, Arete, watched with wise eyes that missed nothing. Between them, the room pulsed with quiet power, the kind born not from force, but from harmony. And in the middle of it all, Odysseus bowed. He bowed not in submission, but in gratitude. Because for the first time in many years, he stood in a hall that asked for nothing but the truth. And yet, truth was something he still could not speak. A stranger among hosts, they fed him before they questioned him. Soft bread, sweet wine, olives cured in honey and salt. He sat not on the floor, but at a table carved from cedar. Warm water was brought for his feet. His hands were gently washed. And though he was surrounded by nobles, none of them looked at him with suspicion. They looked at him like a man. Still, he said little. For Odysseus knew the power of silence. He had worn it like armor, had hidden behind it when the world demanded answers he could not give. He had learned to observe before he spoke, to measure the room, the mood, the risk. Here, though, there was no risk, only curiosity. The people of Phaeacia asked gently who he was, but did not press. They gave him space. They gave him time. And Odysseus, even after so many years of battle and gods and grief, did not quite know what to do with that kind of gift. He watched their children play in the open courtyards, watched the women spin thread that shimmered like moonlight, watched men practice races and dances in fields where the grass was always green. It was a place that breathed joy without effort. And yet, inside him, something still weighed heavy, as if even paradise could not loosen what sorrow had tightened. He spoke when needed, but never about himself. He praised their city, their king, their customs. But his name remained hidden behind his teeth, because once spoken, it would not just belong to him again. It would belong to the world. And he wasn't sure he was ready, for now he was simply a stranger, a man from nowhere, a shadow seated among the golden light of kind people. And though they smiled, and though he smiled back, the silence of his story wrapped him like a cloak. They thought him quiet, thought him humble. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he carried a decade of storm in his chest. And all it would take was the right song to bring it to shore. The song of Troy. It was evening. Torches flickered like stars turned inward. The scent of roasted lamb and smoke drifted lazily through the air. A feast had been laid, not in honor of the stranger, but in honor of hospitality itself. And at the center of it all stood the bard, Demodocus, blind but far from lost. His fingers danced across the lyre, his voice steady as a river, his stories drawn not from scrolls, but from memory and heart. He began to sing, not of harvests or peace, but of war, of a wooden horse built in silence, of warriors hidden in its belly, of Troy asleep in false triumph, and of fire. So much fire, Odysseus froze. He had heard songs before, heard them shouted in battle, whispered in tents, echoed across empty shores. But this was different. This was his war, sung back to him like a reflection he had not prepared to face. The bard's words painted the screams, the clash of blades, the fall of towers, and then the victory. Not a moment of joy, but of silence. A silence that only those who had survived understood. Tears rose before he could stop them. Not loud, not public. Just quiet, unyielding tears. They slid down his face, soft as dew. He turned his head, tried to hide. But it was too late. Alcinous saw. Arete saw. The hall grew still, because in a world of beauty and peace, pain stands out. And here, before them, sat a man who wept at a story the rest only heard. The king asked gently, "Who are you truly?" And this time, Odysseus did not look away. Name and memory returned. He rose slowly, his shoulders heavy not with pride, but with memory. His eyes no longer darted like a stranger's. They met the gaze of those before him with the calm of one who had carried truth too long. "I am Odysseus," he said. The name did not shake the walls. It did not cause thunder. It simply filled the room like a tide that had finally reached the shore. "I am Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, husband of Penelope, father of Telemachus, and I have wandered far." The room held its breath, for names like that are not spoken lightly. They belong in songs, in temples, in memory. But now the legend stood in flesh, tired, human. He told them everything, of Troy, of the Cyclops, of Circe, of the dead who whispered from shadows, of the island of longing, of storms and gods, of hope that flickered like a candle in the dark. He did not embellish, he did not boast. He simply spoke. And the Phaeacians listened, because they knew that sometimes the greatest stories are not told by bards or kings, but by the ones who live them. By the end, there was no applause, only stillness. The kind that comes after a truth has been laid bare. Odysseus sat down. He was no longer a stranger, no longer a shadow. He was Odysseus, remembered, named, seen. And in that moment, the journey, though far from over, felt real again, felt possible. Because once a name is returned to the world, the path home begins to clear. Even if the sea still waits, even if the gods still watch, the man had spoken, and the world had heard. Chapter 8. The Land of No Return. There are journeys that require no compass, only courage. And there are places no man dares to go unless called by something greater than fear, the call of truth. Odysseus, the clever one, the survivor of storms and schemes, now faced a different kind of voyage, one not measured by waves or winds, but by the shadowed hush beneath the world. Under Circe's guidance, he steered his ship beyond the edge of the known, to the realm where the living do not belong. The sea grew quiet as they approached the land of the Cimmerians, a place shrouded in fog where the sun never touched the soil. It was not the silence of peace, but of something waiting, a stillness too deep, like breath held for centuries. Here, the tides no longer whispered, and the sky, gray and blind, cast no reflection. Odysseus' men lowered the sails, unsure if the wind had died or if something had stolen it. The oars dipped into black water, each stroke a descent. They reached a coast of stone. No trees, no birds, no life. Just rock and wind and the scent of forgotten things. This was the boundary between breath and beyond, between warmth and memory. Circe had told him what to do. Dig a trench, pour libations, and offer blood. It was the blood that would open the gate, the blood that the dead would recognize. They would come not because they were invited, but because they were hungry. So, with trembling hands, Odysseus took his blade and cut the earth. The trench filled slowly, dark and waiting. He poured sweet wine, honeyed milk, and water, whispering prayers to the unseen. Then came the blood, thick, steaming in the cold. And with it, the shadows stirred. A pit of blood and voices, the trench became a mirror, not of reflection, but of longing. As the blood seeped into the soil, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Not fully formed, not solid, echoes, fragments, the outline of lives once lived. They gathered at the edge of the trench like moths around flame, drawn not to light. But to the scent of what they had lost, Odysseus stood still, gripping his sword. Circe had warned him, "Do not let them touch the blood until you speak to Tiresias. The dead remember hunger. They will not wake kindly." From the gloom came murmurs, names whispered, regrets half-formed, dreams unfinished. Warriors who had fallen beside him at Troy, friends whose eyes he had closed, men who had died calling his name. He saw them, flickering between the living and the lost. Their voices were not loud, but hollow, as if spoken through a cracked reed. He held them back, asking for one name only, Tiresias, the blind prophet who saw clearer than any who had sight. And at last, the seer came slow, deliberate, untouched by panic. Even in death, Tiresias carried the calm of truth. Odysseus let him drink. The old man's lips touched the blood, and his form grew sharper. He straightened, as though memory was armor. He looked at Odysseus not with eyes, but with knowledge. What he said was not comfort, it was warning wrapped in vision. "You seek home," Tiresias said, "but the path is lined with storms and betrayal. The sun god's cattle must not be touched. If you harm them, destruction follows. And when you reach home, if you reach it, you will find suitors in your hall and strangers in your place. You must cleanse it with steel, then walk once more. Take an oar far inland, where men know not the sea. There, plant it in the earth and speak of peace. Only then your journey will be complete." Odysseus swallowed. These were not choices. They were fates, but still he listened. Still he bowed. A mother's face in smoke he turned then, drawn by a presence not summoned by spell, but by sorrow. A figure moved through the mist, lighter, gentler. Her face was one he knew not from battle, but from birth. Anticlea, his mother. He had not known she had died. He had not known he had lost her. And now she was here, not to scold, not to chide, but to weep. She did not rush to him. She hovered, a figure carved from grief and fog. "My son," she sighed, "I died longing for news of you. Waiting by the shore, watching the horizon, hoping to see your sail." Her words were wind, soft, full of ache, touching him without touch. He tried to embrace her, but his arms found only air. 3 times he reached, 3 times she vanished. "It is the law," she said, "the law of the dead. We remember love, but we no longer feel it." She spoke of Ithaca, of Penelope's tears, of Telemachus growing tall without a father's hand. She spoke of the weariness of waiting, the weight of silence, the cracks that appeared in her spirit before her body gave way, and Odysseus wept. Not the tears of a warrior, but of a son, a child whose journey had taken him too far for too long. His mother's voice passed through him like a song half remembered, too beautiful to bear. Then she, too, faded. Not in anger, but in peace. As if her task had been fulfilled, to speak, to remind, to leave. Her absence filled the space more than her presence had. Prophecies and warnings the pit still whispered. Even as the trench dried and the blood sank into earth, the dead lingered, some begging, some silent. But the air had changed. Tiresias' words clung to Odysseus like mist that would not lift. He thought of the sun god's cattle, sacred, untouchable. He thought of his men, tired, reckless, tempted. He thought of Ithaca, no longer a dream, but a place changed by time. Could he return and still belong? Could home remain home after such a journey? The oar, that strange symbol, haunted him. To carry it inland, far from the salt of the sea, to find a place where none had heard of ships. Only there to plant it in the earth, as if planting his past. A ritual not of arrival, but of release. Odysseus understood. His journey was not only of body, but of spirit. He had seen too much, borne too much. The home he sought would never be what he left. And yet, he must go. He must try. That was his fate. Not joy, not peace, but motion. A tide that could not rest. He turned from the trench. The dead no longer reached for him. They had said their truths, sung their dirges, vanished into the fog. The sun still did not rise in this land, but something in him did. A quiet resolve. Not of triumph, but of endurance. As he stepped back toward the ship, the wind returned. Faint, but present. A breath not of the dead, but of the world he still belonged to. He did not look back. Some things are meant to be seen only once. Some places are meant to be left behind. And as the ship pulled from shore, the realm of the dead faded behind them, not with thunder, but with silence. A silence that would echo in him forever. For in the land of no return, Odysseus had found more than prophecy. He had found the weight of memory, the truth of loss, and the shadow of what it means to live. And so, with eyes open to sorrow and sails full of the unknown, he sailed on, toward storms, toward choices, toward the fading line of home. Chapter 9. The Temptations of the Sea. The wind carried them gently, as if the gods were silent for once, as if the world had paused between storms. The sails swelled softly, and the water shimmered like melted silver. But beauty is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is the first sign of danger. The air felt different now, too sweet, too still. And Odysseus knew what lay ahead, a song not meant to be heard, and a temptation no man should face alone. Circe had warned him of the sirens. Their song was not just music, it was desire itself, shaped into sound. They did not lure with promises of flesh or gold, but with a deeper hunger, the wish to know, to remember, to rest. Their voices promised truth, wrapped in beauty, and the minds of men melted into it like waxen sun. No sailor had ever heard their voices and lived to tell of it. So Odysseus prepared. He took wax and softened it in the sun, pressing it gently into the ears of his crew. Their faces were solemn, for they too had heard stories of the song that steals the soul. Then, as his men rowed, deaf to the coming danger, Odysseus did something few would dare. He had them bind him to the mast. Hands trembling, they tied him tight with ropes that crossed his chest and arms, as he commanded them not to release him no matter what he said, no matter how he pleaded. And then they came, the sirens. They were not creatures of ugliness, nor of flesh alone. They shimmered on their rock like dreams given shape. Their lips barely moved, yet their voices filled the air like perfume. Odysseus heard them, clear, terrible, and beautiful. Odysseus, they sang, son of Laertes, great tactician, breaker of Troy. Come closer, come hear what only the dead know. We know all what lies behind you, and all that waits ahead. His body strained against the ropes. His mouth opened, shouting for the crew to turn, to steer toward the song. His eyes filled with longing, not just for the women, but for what they promised: understanding, completion, rest. But the ropes held, and the men ears stopped with. Wax rode on, blind to his cries. The song faded as distance grew, the spell undone not by strength, but by silence. And when the ropes were finally cut, Odysseus fell to his knees, not in relief, but in grief. A part of him had stayed behind, a part that now knew longing without end. Between rock and whirlpool, there are choices that define a man, and some that break him. Before them now lay a strait so narrow, it seemed the sea had forgotten how to breathe. To one side rose the jagged mouth of Scylla, a beast hidden in stone. To the other, the swirling belly of Charybdis, a whirlpool so deep it drank the ocean itself. Circe had told him this would come. You cannot fight both, she warned. Choose Scylla, though she will take your men. Charybdis will take all. Odysseus did not share this truth with his crew. He gripped the tiller, silent. The sky had grown darker, not with storm, but with dread. He ordered the men to row, slow and steady, and he did not let his eyes drift to the waves. But the sound came, first a sucking breath, like the sea sighing, then a roar as Charybdis opened her mouth and pulled down the tide. The ship leaned, trembling, straining at the seams. To the other side, there was nothing but shadow clinging to the cliff. And from that shadow came a flash, 6 necks, 6 fangs dripping. Scylla struck without warning. Like lightning, she snatched 6 men from the deck, men with names, with homes, with mothers who still waited. They vanished into her cave, and their cries were short. It happened fast, too fast to stop, too fast to grieve. Odysseus held the tiller. His jaw clenched. He did not scream. He did not weep. But something in him changed. He had chosen to live, and in doing so, had chosen death for others. The ship cleared the strait. The waves calmed. The sky softened. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was absence. 6 oars no longer moved. 6 voices no longer spoke, and Odysseus, once a commander, now a mourner, stared ahead, staring through waters that no longer seemed to flow. The island of the sun. Days later, weary and worn, they saw land again. It was golden, not with gold, but with light. Tall grass shimmered. Trees stood still, as if listening. And in the meadows beyond, sacred cattle grazed under the eye of the sun. This was Thrinacia, the island of Helios, the sun god, and his herds were not to be touched. Circe had warned them. Tiresias had repeated it. Do not harm the cattle. No matter how hungry, no matter how long the storm keeps you there. Odysseus told his men this again and again. But hunger is louder. Then memory. They anchored the ship and stepped ashore. At first, all obeyed. They hunted small birds, searched for roots, prayed for winds to return. But the days passed, and the storm did not move. The skies burned blue, but the sea stayed rough, a prison made of glass and waves. Food ran out, stomachs ached. Sleep became restless. Dreams turned bitter. And one night, while Odysseus wandered alone in prayer, his men acted. They killed the cattle. They roasted the flesh. And the smoke curled upward, carrying their sin to the sky. When Odysseus returned, it was already done. He stared at the bones and the fire, the fat dripping on the stones. The faces of his men, full not of guilt, but of silent relief. The next morning the sky cracked. Thunder, though no cloud. Light though no sun. And the sea began to turn. Return to the ship in fear, but fear would not save them now. The gods had heard, and they would not speak, not in words, but in winds and waves and wrath. The silence of Helios was not quiet. It screamed through every gust, every crash, every roll of thunder. It screamed in judgment. The last survivor, the sea rose like a wall. The ship groaned. The sky split open. One by one, the crew fell, washed overboard, swept into the deep, broken. Against the mast, Odysseus could not stop it. He clung to wreckage, wood barely holding its shape as the ship tore apart beneath him. The storm took everything. Every man, every name, every promise. The ocean, once his path, had become a mouth that devoured. Only he remained, adrift, alone on a piece of broken timber. Days passed, though the sun never seemed to move. He floated, not with direction, but with memory. Each wave was a voice, each ripple a face. They had trusted him, followed him, and now they were gone. He was no longer a captain, no longer a warrior, just a man clinging to what little was left. The sea had tested him, and though he lived, he did not win. Survival is not always a prize, and yet the tide did not let go. It carried him, not gently, but steadily, toward another shore, toward another trial. He drifted with eyes half open, half dreaming. Somewhere in the distance, an island waited, not Ithaca, not yet, but something in between. A place where he could breathe, just for a while. He did not know how many days had passed. He did not count. Time, too, had been taken, but even in the weight of all he had lost, a thought remained, not loud, not proud, just a flicker. I am still here, and in the vastness of the sea, in the sorrow that covered the sky, that thought, that whisper, was enough to drift. Enough to survive, and perhaps, someday, enough to begin again. Chapter 10. The Queen Who Waited. The sea was not the only place where battles brewed. Far from the crashing waves and the cry of gulls, there was a quieter storm, the slow, aching kind that swells within walls, in rooms filled with silence and eyes that watch too closely. Ithaca, once a kingdom of peace, now held its breath. And in its heart sat a woman, not armored in steel, but in patience. Her name was Penelope. While Odysseus drifted between gods and grief, she remained not idle, but steady. Her castle had become a stage for wolves, dressed in finery, grinning as they gnawed at her husband's legacy. They called themselves suitors, but their intentions reeked of hunger. They dined on her stores, drank from her cellars, laughed at her quiet. But Penelope was not prey. She was the thread that held Ithaca from unraveling. Each morning she walked to the loom. Her fingers moved with purpose, weaving a shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's aging father, or so she said. The threads crossed and pulled, forming patterns that whispered of mourning, of waiting, of love held in pause. But when the moon rose and shadows stretched long across stone, she returned to the loom in secret and slowly, gently undid her work. One strand at a time that she wove by day, unwove by night, a cycle of devotion and deception. In each pull of thread, she bought herself time, not just days, but dignity. For as long as the shroud remained unfinished, she had a reason not to choose. A new husband, a reason to wait, and so she waited. not passively, but fiercely. In every stitch, there was memory. In every unraveling, there was resistance. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Her sorrow was not surrender, it was a shield. And while the world outside forgot what loyalty looked like, Penelope remembered. The courtship of theft, the suitors came in numbers, sons of noblemen, war-blooded and wine-drenched. They filled the halls with laughter that did not reach the eyes. They sang songs that praised their own names and mocked the man whose throne they now circled like vultures. Each believed himself worthy of the crown, of the home, and of the queen. They brought gifts of gold and garments, spices and silver. But their offerings were not to honor, they were to conquer. They treated the palace as plunder, not sanctuary. Each meal they devoured felt like another stone pulled from the foundation. Servants shuffled nervously. Old allies remained quiet. Ithaca bent beneath the weight of these false kings. Yet Penelope stood, graceful, unreadable, calm. She met their words with measured smiles, their boasts with gentle nods. She promised nothing, and in that promise revealed everything. Thought her weak. They mistook mourning for indecision. But they did not see the fire behind her eyes, the fire that waited, quiet but constant. Like the lamp she kept burning in the window each night, just in case a sail ever appeared on the horizon. Some mocked her, others flattered her. All underestimated her doubt, and so the dance continued. Days turned to weeks, weeks to years. Suitors grew restless, arrogant, but she never faltered. She did not fight with swords, but with patience, with presence. With the refusal to break, she became the eye of the storm, still, sacred, impossible to touch. Dreams that taste of salt in the dark of night when the castle grew quiet and even the suitors slept off their wine, Penelope would lie awake. The walls seemed to breathe, heavy with longing. Outside, the waves sang songs only she could hear, songs of a man who once held her hand with tenderness, and storm-sleep came in fragments. And when it did, it brought dreams that tasted of salt. Sometimes she stood on the cliffs above the sea, wind in her hair, watching a ship that never reached shore. Other times, she saw Odysseus, not as he had been, but as a shadow moving through the halls, just out of reach. Once she dreamed of a bird, a great hawk, fierce and wild, flying low over a flock of geese. The geese scattered in fear, and the hawk vanished. She awoke in tears, unsure why. And yet, deep in her soul, something stirred. The dream lingered, not as a warning, but as a whisper. Even in waking, the lines between vision and memory blurred. A scent, a sound, the way sunlight hit a particular stair, all of it opened wounds. She remembered his laughter, his calloused hands, the way he listened. She remembered the silence that followed his leaving, years of it. And yet, she could not name her grief, not fully. Not while hope still flickered like the lamp in her chamber. Grief waits for certainty. Penelope lived in the space between dots, so she carried her sorrow like a second skin, invisible to most, but always there. And when she walked the corridors, when she faced the men who wanted to replace her husband, she did so not just as a queen, but as a woman stitched together by memory and faith. The choice of the bow time, however, waits for no one. Even the most patient heart must someday choose. And Penelope, after years of silence and sorrow, knew the moment had come. She descended the stairs into the hall, dressed in mourning white. The suitors turned, surprised by her calm. She stood among them, tall and tired, and spoke. "If none of you will leave, then one of you must win." A murmur spread. She lifted a hand, silencing them. "You shall try to string the bow of Odysseus, and not just string it, shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined in a row. If you can do this, I will be yours." Gasps echoed. The bow, carved from polished horn, strung with sinew, had not been touched in years. It was not a weapon. It was a memory, a challenge, a gate. One by one, they tried. Muscles strained, faces turned red. The bow would not bend. It refused their hands, their pride, their claim. They cursed. They laughed nervously. They failed and then, in the shadows of the room, a stranger stepped forward. Cloaked in rags, a beggar to their eyes. But his hands, they moved with knowing. He asked for the bow. Laughter followed. Penelope said nothing. He strung it with ease. As if it remembered him. He pulled back the arrow, steady and sure, and released. The arrow flew clean, straight, through all 12 axe heads. Silence fell, the kind that feels like thunder held in the chest. Penelope did not cry. She did not run. She simply looked. At the man really looked. And in his eyes, past the years, the scars, the beard, she saw the truth. The shadow in her dreams had found its shape. He had returned. And the waiting was over. But more than that, she had endured. Not as a statue frozen in time, but as a soul who chose love over fear, dignity over despair. She had waited. But she had also lived. And now, with the bow returned, and the suitors staring in disbelief, Ithaca would remember who its queen was, and who she had always been. Chapter 11. Father and Son. The winds had grown gentler now. The sea had spat out its last bitterness, and Odysseus, salt-stained, scarred, and silent, had finally stepped onto the soil of his homeland. Yet it was not to fanfare or flags that he returned, but to the quiet of a pigsty nestled in the hills above a forgotten Ithaca. It was here, beneath the thatched roof and beside the soft grunts of sleeping swine, that he sought refuge, not as a king, but as a beggar. Who offered him shelter was old, weathered, and kind, Eumaeus, a swineherd by title, but in truth, a sentinel of loyalty. Years had folded into decades since his master had sailed away. Yet Eumaeus had not abandoned his place, nor allowed his memory of Odysseus to fade. He had served faithfully, feeding the pigs, watching the stars, and waiting for a return many had given up on. He welcomed the stranger not with suspicion, but with bread and warmth. His hut was humble, smoke-stained walls, clay cups, a small fire flickering in the hearth, but the hospitality was richer than any palace. He listened, as the ragged man spoke of long journeys and far-off lands. But though the stories were cloaked in false names and twisted truths, Eumaeus felt something stir. Loyalty has a language all its own, one that doesn't need proof or recognition. It speaks in gestures, in glances, in quiet offerings. And as Eumaeus handed the beggar his best blanket, he saw, beneath the grime and weariness, a flicker of something ancient. Not just a man, but a memory trying to return to life. He didn't question it aloud. He simply let him stay. For in his heart he knew, this man, this wanderer, belonged to the soil of Ithaca. And sometimes, love remembers what the eyes have. Forgotten. The return of the prince. Meanwhile, another ship kissed the shore of Ithaca. Not a warrior's vessel, nor a conqueror's fleet, but a small craft carrying something even rarer than victory: hope. Telemachus had returned. The boy who once clung to stories and shadows was now a young man shaped by storms. His face bore the sun of distant lands. His eyes held more than questions now, they held answers carved from absence. He had journeyed far, seeking word of a father he had never truly known, and now he returned not with news, but with resolve. The island that raised him did not cheer. No trumpet sang for the prince's return. The suitors still feasted in his hall. The kingdom still slept beneath the weight of decay. But Telemachus no longer walked in fear. His steps were sure, his gaze forward. Guided by Athena's unseen hand, he made his way to the hills, to the swineherd's hut, to a fire that still burned beneath a roof of straw. When he arrived, Eumaeus rushed to him like a father seeing his own son reborn. Their embrace was wordless. The years between them vanished, but the beggar in the corner, he watched, quietly, intently. And as Telemachus sat, recounting tales of his voyage, Odysseus sat across from him in silence, absorbing the voice he had missed for 20 years. Every tone, every movement, every moment, he memorized it all. For the first time in decades, father and son shared the same air. Yet neither knew the fullness of the truth. Not yet, but the hearth was warm, and the gods were listening. Truth revealed by touch. When the moment came, it was not marked by thunder or divine thunderbolt. It came softly, like all great truths do. Athena appeared, unseen to all but Odysseus. Her hand brushed across him, and the years of grime, the cloak of age, the disguise of wandering, all of it fell away. The beggar's back straightened. His shoulders grew broader. His beard darkened. His eyes, once dulled by salt and sorrow, gleamed with the fire of kingship once more. Telemachus turned to look, and for a breathless second he did not move. The man before him was no longer a stranger, no longer a story. He was real. Father? The word left him like a breath long held. And with it, the years broke open. Odysseus stepped forward. No speech, no declarations. He opened his arms. Telemachus moved like a child again, falling into them. They wept. The kind of tears that carry lifetimes, not the tears of battle, nor of pride, but the tears of recognition of a bond lost and found, of questions finally answered. There were no witnesses, save for the swineherd and the gods. But in that moment, something ancient was healed. A circle closed. A line that had been broken was stitched together again, and in that embrace, Ithaca stirred. Not yet awake, but no longer fully asleep. A plan forged in silence. They did not shout. They did not gather swords. The path forward was drawn not in rage, but in resolve. Father and son sat by the fire, their heads close, their words few. The plan was simple, precise, quiet. Odysseus would return to the palace, not as a king, but again as a beggar. He would walk among the suitors, unseen, unwelcomed. He would learn their names. He would measure their pride. Telemachus would return too, with caution. He would hide his strength behind courtesy, his fury behind silence. Together, they would wait, like hunters in the tall grass. The bow, Odysseus's bow, would be the test. the one no suitor could bend, the one only the rightful king could wield. When the moment came, the storm would not be loud. It would be sharp, swift, unmistakable. But until then, they waited. Two shadows moving through halls that once bore their names. Two hearts, stitched together by pain, now beating with purpose. In the hush of the hut, with the fire low and the stars watching from beyond the thatched roof, Odysseus looked at his son. "You are my blood," he whispered, "and my hope." Telemachus did not answer. He did not need to. His hand rested on his father's shoulder, firm, steady. Sometimes, silence is the loudest vow. And as the night deepened, and the wind carried stories through the trees, Ithaca, still dreaming, began to remember the names it had forgotten. King had returned, and the son had become a man, and together they would awaken a sleeping kingdom. Chapter 12. Shadows in the Palace. The house once rang with the sound of Odysseus' footsteps, bold and certain, like a king whose name weighed as much as bronze, but now it heard them again, softer, slippered in rags and dust. Disguised as a wandering beggar, cloaked in grime and age, the great Odysseus moved through the halls that were once his realm. Gone were the banners, the songs, the warmth of familiar glances. In their place, a strange stillness, a gnawing disorder masked by the scent of burning meats and mocking laughter. In this place he had built with his own hands, strangers now reigned. And he, the true lord, was beneath notice. By the crumbling wall near the stables, he met Melanthius, the goat herd. A man of crude words and smaller loyalties. Once a servant, now swollen with the pride that comes when order shatters. The sight of the ragged figure stirred nothing noble in him. Instead, with a sneer on his face and arrogance in his heart, Melanthius struck the old man's side with the heel of his boot. A sharp kick, unworthy of its target, yet Odysseus did not flinch. He bore the pain like a rock beneath the sea, steady, unmoved. But the pain was not from the blow. It was from the decay, from the dishonor that had seeped into the bones of his household. Even the lowless dared to lift a hand to their king. It was a world flipped on its head. And yet he stayed silent. For now, his time was not yet come. Like a hunter crouched in stillness, he waited, gathering shadows like a cloak. Let them believe he was broken. Let them laugh and pass him by. The reckoning would come as sure as the tide returns to shore. The dog who remembered among the many who had forgotten him, who walked past him as if he were a stranger carved from dust, there was one who knew. One who saw, not with eyes clouded by years, but with the quiet instinct of love. Old. Now and heavy with time, the dog lay on a heap of dung outside the palace gates, his body weak, his limbs stiff with sleep that never fully lifted. Flies circled lazily around him. No servant tended to him. No suitor cared. He was the last thread of a world that had frayed, and yet, when the beggar passed, when those tired feet shuffled into view, something within the old dog stirred. His ears pricked, his head lifted with effort he had not summoned in years. The scent faint beneath the dust and disguise was unmistakable. It was him, his master, the one he had waited for through every cold night, through every season of silence. Argos tried to rise. His legs trembled, but he managed only to wag his tail slowly once. That single movement spoke louder than words. In that moment, Odysseus turned and looked at him, and their eyes met one last time. A silent reunion. a recognition not bound by disguise. He could not speak to the dog. He could not kneel, lest the house of lies he had built come crumbling too soon. But a tear ran down his cheek, hidden by the shadow of his hood, and then the tale fell still. The chest stopped rising. Argos, faithful till the end, had seen his master home. He had waited, and now he could rest. The last piece of Odysseus' past had said farewell, quietly, without fanfare, but with all the loyalty the world had forgotten. The beggar at the feast, the hall of the palace glowed with torchlight. Music hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of roasted boar and spilled wine. Laughter rang louder than sense. The suitors, dozens of them, feasted like kings in a house not their own, each one louder than the last, each one certain the throne would soon be his. At the edge of it all, near the smoke-blackened wall, sat the beggar. Odysseus, still cloaked in his disguise, asked for scraps, and they tossed him crumbs with the same disdain one might toss to a dog. He knelt low, shoulders curved, hands outstretched, not in weakness but in study, watching, listening, every word, every boast, every mocking glance. He stored it like a ledger in his mind, not out of vengeance, but out of duty. The house must be made whole again, and to do so, he must know the rot that festered inside. Then came Antinous, a suitor of proud manner and sharper tongue. He looked upon the beggar as if he were filth upon the marble. With a sneer, he hurled a wooden stool, striking the beggar on the shoulder. Laughter erupted around the hall. Even some servants dared a smile. But the gods, though silent, did not smile. In the heavens they watched. The one who should not have struck had struck, and the one who should not have been struck had bled, though not from flesh, but from memory. For in that moment, the cruelty of the suitors was carved deeper into fate. Still, Odysseus did not rise. He did not cry out. He simply lowered his head again and took the crumbs that were offered. Like a fire smothered with ashes, he burned beneath the surface. The day was drawing close. The day when these tables would be turned and the feast would end not in music, but in silence. The queen who knows nothing, yet in the quiet of night, long after the wine had dulled the suitors' tongues, Penelope sat by the loom. She was weaving again, as she had done for years, by candlelight, in silence, in patience. She wove a tapestry of unspoken sorrow, of days lost, and of a heart that waited without proof. Outside, the world changed. Inside, her heart stayed loyal. The beggar was brought before her. Word had reached her, an old man of strange presence, wise in speech, broken in body. She looked upon him and felt something shift. Not recognition, no, not yet, but a stirring, a discomfort in the familiar, like hearing a lullaby from childhood in the voice of a stranger. His manner, his words, his gaze, there was something steady, something knowing. And she, the queen who had not cried aloud in years, found herself leaning in. They spoke of Odysseus. The beggar told her he had seen the king, that he would return, that he was near, and her eyes filled with unshed tears, not because she believed, but because she wanted to, so badly. And still she could not yet. Hope was dangerous. It fed the wolves of grief. She offered the beggar rest and warmth and food, not out of charity, but out of respect. Something inside her had been touched, a memory perhaps, or a premonition. But she said nothing more. She only returned to her loom, weaving not just cloth, but time. Every thread she pulled was a thread closer to destiny. Outside her chamber, Odysseus stepped back into the shadows. His heart was full. Her spirit had not changed. Her light had not dimmed. Though the world had forgotten him, she had not truly lost him. Only time now stood between their reunion. And so the palace slept, unaware that under its very roof the storm gathered, silent and slow. A reckoning shaped not with rage, but with righteousness. A man, once lost, now inches from reclaiming his place, not by force, but by patience. In a world that had turned upside down, he was the still point, the truth hiding in plain sight. And soon the mask would fall. But not tonight. Tonight he would let the shadows keep his secret. Just a little longer. Chapter 13, The Bow and the Blood. Morning broke slow and golden over Ithaca. Inside the great hall, the torches still glowed dim with the remnants of last night's feast, and the air was thick with the scent of meat, mead, and perfume. The suitors, fat with confidence and flushed from wine, reclined upon skins and pillows, their laughter echoing under the wooden beams like the caws of crows. None among them suspected that the sun rising that morning would set on the last day of their lives. They did not know that they were not lords, but lambs, and the slaughter had already begun in silence. In the corner of the hall stood a great bow, long and curved, carved from horn and polished with care no one now remembered. Beside it lay a quiver and a row of axe heads, their sockets lined in a perfect row, a game designed not for amusement, but for revelation. Penelope had set the challenge. Whosoever could string the bow and send an arrow through the axes would take her hand. Her heart stayed silent, but her soul whispered the truth. Only one man ever could. And so the suitors tried. One by one, they stepped forward with swagger and smirks, each sure he would succeed where the last had failed. They rubbed their hands, flexed their arms, spat on their palms as though disrespect might win what honor could not. But the bow did not bend for arrogance. It did not yield to pride. It stood firm, as though it too had waited years for this moment. One man grunted and turned red with strain. Another yelped as the bow slipped and stung his hand. Laughter followed, then nervous silence. Then more failure. Each attempt stripped away a little of their confidence, like wind wearing down a cliffside. They began to mutter, to blame the bow, the wood, the gods. But it was not the bow that was at fault. It was they who were too small for the task, too false, too cruel. And beneath it all, a beggar watched, quiet, patient, knowing the touch of the true king. Then, with a stillness that was almost holy, the beggar stood. Gasps passed through the room like wind through tall grass. He should not speak. He should not rise. He should not ask for the bow, and yet he did. Penelope paused, her eyes locked on the man she did not yet dare to believe was hers. Telemachus spoke first, his voice calm and unshaken. "Let the beggar try," he said. "Let him hold the bow." And so the beggar stepped forward. Slowly, reverently. He approached the weapon not like a warrior, but like a father reaching out to a long-lost child. His fingers touched the bow's curve, and it sang. Not in sound, but in the way light seemed to soften around it. As though the bow had sighed and said, "At last." The room hushed. All eyes turned toward him. He did not rush. He ran his fingers along the string, feeling the tension, remembering the weight. A man does not forget the song of his own steel. The suitors watched, half in confusion, half in mockery. But something in their eyes began to change. They felt it, though they could not name it. The stillness. The return dot, and then, in one smooth motion, the bow bent. No strain, no struggle, no sweat on the brow. The string found its place. The bow was strung dot, and in that single moment, something shifted in the hall. A silence fell deeper than before. It was as if the air had stopped moving, as if time had paused to look. The beggar no longer seemed a beggar. His back was straighter, his gaze clearer, his hands sure, and the bow in his hand no longer looked like a test. It looked like a crown. The first arrow he reached for a single arrow, not one of the suitors, but one he had chosen himself. The shaft was smooth, the feathers dark. He stepped forward to the line. Before him, the 12 axe heads stood in a perfect row, just as they had for years, untouched. The suitors leaned in, suddenly unsure if they should laugh or run. Odysseus raised the bow. He did not blink. He did not breathe. The string pulled back, silent and tight, a line drawn not just between wood and flesh, but between past and present. The arrow was not just a weapon, it was truth. It was memory. It was justice, shaped and sharpened dot, and then it flew. Time seemed to slow as it passed through the first socket. Then the next, like a needle through cloth, like destiny through time. The arrow flew clean and true and struck the wall beyond with a solid, final thud. The silence that followed was broken not by applause, but by a scream. Antinous, the proudest of them all, had risen in anger. He reached for his goblet, sneering, and that was when Odysseus, now fully seen, turned and notched another arrow. No more hesitation, no more disguise. His eyes blazed with quiet fury, his arm steady as stone. The second arrow flew, but not through axe heads this time. Through Antinous' throat. The cup fell, the wine spilled red across the floor, and the suitors stared in horror at the man they thought was nothing, now standing in the center of the hall, tall and unmoved, bow in hand. "I am Odysseus," he said, his voice low and thunderous. "King of Ithaca, you devoured my home, stole my food, courted my wife, and now you shall pay." The storm unleashed, it began like a whisper. Telemachus, young and fierce, ran to the doors and barred them. No one would escape. Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, and Philotius, the cowherd, stood at the ready with spear and blade. The gods, though unseen, watched with solemn approval. Justice was no longer a dream. It had awakened, and it had drawn its sword. The suitors scrambled like rats in a flood. Some reached for weapons, others begged. But there was no mercy in that hall, only memory. For every night Penelope had wept alone. For every day Telemachus had been mocked. For every servant struck. For every name forgotten. Blood would now answer. Arrow after arrow flew. Odysseus moved with the grace of one chosen by gods. His eyes never faltered. His hands never missed. Telemachus fought beside him, blade flashing, air of both name and wrath. The hall, once a place of song, now echoed with screams and the sound of sandals slipping in blood. Still they fought. Still the arrows flew. Men who had once laughed at beggars now crawled on their knees. The tables were overturned. The fires guttered. Shadows danced on the walls like spirits of vengeance. And then, at last, the final suitor fell. The final cry faded into silence. Odysseus stood among the bodies, his tunic torn, his arms stained red, but his eyes calm, not wild with rage, but full of the peace that comes only when something lost has been returned. Penelope was not yet there. The hall was still. The storm had passed, and yet, in its wake, something had been reborn. Not just a man, not just a house, but a kingdom, a memory, a name. Odysseus. The bow rested beside him now, its purpose fulfilled. It had sung its last song, and in doing so, restored the world to its rightful rhythm. Outside, the sun had climbed high, and though the wind carried the scent of ash and blood, it also carried something new, the breath of a home reclaimed, and in the silence, one could almost hear the walls exhale. They remembered him, and now, so did the world. Chapter 14. Cleansing the House. Dawn rose over Ithaca, not gently, but with a strange weight in its light. Where there had once been laughter and the sound of goblets clinking against stone, there was now only the quiet drip of blood onto marble. The storm had passed. The suitors lay where they had fallen, limbs twisted, mouths open mid-curse, eyes staring into a silence they could no longer speak to. The hall, Odysseus' hall, no longer echoed with arrogance, but neither did it yet sing of peace. Odysseus stood in the stillness, breathing not with triumph, but with sorrow. The price had been exacted, but justice is never simple. Its edges are sharp and its reach is long. Around him, servants emerged from their hiding places, slowly, cautiously, like animals unsure whether the danger had passed or only changed its shape. Some dropped to their knees and wept, overcome with the return of their master. Others trembled, unsure whether their silence during the years of absence would now be counted as betrayal. And then came the reckoning. Odysseus did not shout. His voice did not rise in wrath. But he asked names. He asked who had helped, who had looked away, who had fed the mouths of the suitors while Penelope wept alone. Telemachus stood beside him, his young eyes hard with the memory of insult. Eumaeus named those who had stood firm. Philoetius pointed to those who had opened doors that should have stayed shut. Some servants fell at Odysseus' feet, crying out their loyalty. Others tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. A few were led to the courtyard where ropes were prepared. Their eyes met their king's, pleading not for mercy, but for understanding. And in that look was the great tragedy of war, that the line between loyalty and survival is as thin as a strand of silk, and just as easily broken. And yet, it had to be done. The house had to be made clean. A kingdom built on forgiveness alone cannot stand. It needs truth. And truth, today, came with tears and silence and the creak of rope in the morning wind. The song and the silence in the corner of the hall. Beneath the shadow of a broken harp sat Phemius the bard. His fingers, once nimble with strings, now clutched each other in prayer. He had played for the suitors, yes. He had sung their glories, laughed when commanded, raised his voice in false joy to survive. But now, in the quiet aftermath, his heart beat with dread. He had made music in a time of rot. Was that enough to damn him? Odysseus approached him, the echo of his steps bouncing off the blood-stained walls. The bard looked up, his mouth dry, his eyes wide. "I was made to play," he whispered. "They forced the song into my throat, and though he trembled, he did not run. He waited to be judged, harp at his feet like an offering. Telemachus stepped forward then, laying a hand on his father's arm. "He is innocent," he said softly. His music kept hope alive in the hearts of those who still listened. Even I found comfort in his voice. Odysseus looked at the man and saw not a traitor, but a mirror. A soul who had masked his truth to survive, just as he had. The king nodded once. "Sing no more lies," he said gently. "But sing again," and so the bard was spared. The harp, though cracked, would ring again. Because even in a house scarred by betrayal, the voice of art must not be silenced. Music had lived through sorrow, through violence, through shame. It had bent, but not broken. And still the hall remained quiet. No song could erase what had been done. The notes would come later, slowly. For now, the silence sang truest of all. Blood and smoke the day waned, and with it came the work that no poem could ever capture. Buckets of water, claws turned dark with blood, lime for the floors, torches for the corners where shadows lingered too long. Odysseus ordered the bodies to be carried out. The suitors once proud, perfumed, dressed in gold, were now nothing more than weight and memory. They were burned outside the city walls, their names not spoken again, but fire alone could not cleanse the rot. The walls had heard too much. The air itself held grief, so sulfur was brought, sharp and biting. Its smoke filled the rooms, curling into rafters, choking the scent of death. From the wood, every surface was scrubbed, every cushion burned. The feast tables, once carved with pride, were split and thrown to flame. No one laughed, no one sang. The house wept in its own way. The smoke rose like incense, not for prayer, but for purification. It was not vengeance that filled the air now, it was the ache of starting over. And when the sun dipped behind the western hills, the flames finally died down. The hall stood quiet. The blood was gone from the stones, but the memory would remain faint and eternal, like a scar beneath polished skin. Odysseus stood at the threshold and watched the smoke drift into the sky. Not triumph, not peace. Something else, the breath between endings and beginnings. The moment when the past releases its grip, and the future has not yet spoken. The queen still waits, and yet, through all this, Penelope had not come. She had heard the cries. She had heard the silence. She had watched the smoke rise from her window, but she had not run to him. She had not wept in the doorway or thrown herself into his arms. She stayed seated in her chamber, her loom untouched, her hands resting in her lap like folded wings, because her heart had waited too long. And memory, when stretched too far, begins to fray. Odysseus stood now outside her door. Behind him, the hall had been cleansed, the traitors judged, the weapons sheathed. But he knew that the final proof was not in his strength. It was in his truth. Penelope looked at him when he entered, but her face did not break into joy. Her voice was soft. "They say you are him," she whispered, "but many men can say that name." And so he spoke to her, not as a king, but as a husband. He told her of their bed, not just of its shape or smell, but of its secret, that one leg was carved from living olive, still rooted to the earth. That he had built it with his hands, and only she knew the truth of it. At those words, something broke within her. A silence, long kept. The ache of 20 years rushed to her eyes. She rose, her hands trembling, and crossed the room as if walking through a dream. She touched his face, not with hunger or fire, but with the gentleness of certainty, of recognition, of home. You are truly him, she breathed. And he nodded, eyes full, not of pride, but of return. They stood together, not in a palace, not in a throne room, but in a quiet chamber where love had waited, faithfully, quietly, without proof. The storm was over, but peace, true peace, is not the absence of war. It is the presence of what was once lost, now found. And as night fell over Ithaca, and the stars blinked open one by one, the house finally rested. It had remembered its king, and its queen had remembered love. Chapter 15. The marriage bed. The hall was quiet now. The blood scrubbed from the stones, the fire reduced to soft embers. And yet, within the chambers of the palace, the greatest silence had not yet been broken, not by swords or servants, not even by justice. For a silence lived between two souls, not empty, but full of 20 years. A silence heavy with waiting. Odysseus stood before her. No disguise now, no rags, no mask. Only the lines on his face, carved by sea and sorrow, and the eyes that still burned with the old fire. Penelope sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, her breath steady. But her heart, hidden beneath the stillness, beat with the weight of hope and fear. Could this really be him? Not just a man with the right name, the right voice, the right face, but him. The one she had dreamed of, doubted, prayed for, and wept over for 2 decades. She spoke softly. "If you are truly Odysseus," she said, "then tell me of our bed." The room stilled at those words. Even the walls seemed to lean in, for this was a test no stranger could pass. Odysseus did not hesitate. His voice, low and steady, reached back through time. "The bed," he said, "is rooted into the earth, one leg carved from the living olive tree. I built the room around it. The trunk still breathes within the stone. No man can move it, not without breaking it apart." He paused, and in his eyes the memory lived not as a fact, but as a feeling. The scent of fresh wood, the warmth of her smile, the rhythm of his hammer as he worked with love, not haste. Only one who had laid beside her on that bed, one who had shaped it with his hands and heart, could speak of it that way. And so the silence broke, not with fanfare, but with truth. The kind that does not shout, but stands quietly and cannot be moved. The queen breaks. She had held herself together for so long, through the seasons, through the loneliness, through the cruel parade of suitors who smiled with teeth but never saw her soul. Penelope had been fortress and flame, wound and healer. And now her walls cracked. Tears welled up before she could stop them. Her breath caught, and she let out a sound, not quite a sob, but something older, something deeper. It was the sound of a dam giving way, of grief finally finding a mouth. She stood, stumbled, then ran. Her feet barely touched the floor as she crossed the room, and then she was in his arms. Her hands clutched his tunic, her cheek pressed to his chest. She wept, not the tears of weakness, but of return, of release, of having endured and now no longer needing to. He held her, gently, tightly, as if letting go again would shatter the world. Their embrace did not burn with the fire of youth, but it glowed, steady and golden, with the light of something earned, something real, not the longing of dreams, but the proof of survival. No words were needed. Not yet. The truth was in the way she breathed against him. The way his hand brushed her hair like he was memorizing it again. The way her tears soaked his shoulder, and he did not move. It had taken them 20 years to find this moment. And in it, all that was broken began to mend. The night held back outside, the stars blinked awake. The moon climbed slowly, brushing its light against the roof tiles of Ithaca's palace. But time, so eager to rush forward, paused. For even the gods, those restless, ancient watchers, knew to be still. Athena, gray-eyed and wise, looked upon them and softened. Her hand, always ready to guide the fates of men, now reached for the sky and slowed the chariot of the sun. Let night last a little longer, she thought. Let this reunion not be rushed by dawn. And so the night lingered. The wind held its breath. The world made room for love to return fully. Odysseus and Penelope sat upon their marriage bed, not as strangers, not as echoes, but as husband and wife. The candles flickered low, their flames swaying like dancers listening to a distant song. No urgency stirred between them. No need to fill the silence with explanations or pleas. Time had already spoken for them. Now, all that remained was the grace of being seen, truly, deeply, without question. In that chamber, the past did not haunt them. It simply sat with them, quiet and acknowledged. Like an old friend who no longer needed to speak, they did not. Sleep. Sleep was for the weary. And they were not weary now, not in spirit. They were full, present, whole again. And so, beneath a sky held still by divine hands, they began to speak. Tales and tears that started softly. A sentence, a name, a place. Then another. He told her of the storm that shattered his ships, of the island of the Lotus Eaters, of the cave of the Cyclops and the blinding escape. She listened, not with disbelief, but with wonder, for she had known the man who would endure such trials. She had always known. She asked about Circe, about Calypso. His voice trembled, not with shame, but with the weight of truth. And she nodded. Not every road is chosen. Some are endured. What mattered most was that he had returned through temptation, through loss, through myth and memory. And then he listened. She told him of the nights she spent weaving and unweaving the burial shroud, of the footsteps outside her door, of the way she had learned to speak little so that her heart would not betray her, of Telemachus, his growth, his strength, his eyes that so often looked like his father's. He wept quietly as she spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just soft tears, steady, like a river coming home to sea. Their stories were not told to impress, but to heal. Each word an offering, each memory a bridge. They did not try to explain the years away, they simply held them, together like hands clasped in the dark. The night deepened, and still they spoke, not with urgency, but with patience, with reverence. They were no longer two people separated by time. They were one story, woven again, and when the stars began to fade, when the first hints of dawn colored the sky, they lay down, side by side, on the bed that could not be moved. They did not speak of tomorrow. Tomorrow would come, but for now, in the hush of the fading night, they had returned to each other, to home, to love. Chapter 16. The Father in the Orchard. The orchard was quiet. It had always been quiet, but now it carried the hush of something sacred. The trees stood in rows like sleeping sentinels, their boughs gently curved, heavy with ripening fruit. End time. Underneath them walked an old man, bent with years, slower now than he had ever been. His hands, thick with calluses, moved across the bark with memory. This was not just tending, this was grieving. Laertes, once a warrior, once a prince in the courts of Ithaca, had traded his place in the palace for soil and silence. He no longer spoke of kings or kingdoms. He spoke with the roots. Each tree had a name. Some bore the names of the women he had loved. Others were called for storms or seas. But one he had planted when his son was born, stood in the middle of the orchard, twisted and tall, as if reaching for a voice it had not heard in years. That tree he did not name aloud anymore. Its name lived only in his bones. There were days when Laertes forgot the sound of his own speech, for none came to visit. Servants brought him food and water, but they left quietly, unwilling to interrupt the sacred melancholy that clung to the orchard like morning dew. His robes were faded, his feet bare. His beard had grown wild and white. To any passerby, he was not a nobleman, not a man who once fought in grand battles. He was simply the one who dressed in dust, but the orchard knew. The orchard always knew. Each dawn, Laertes would rise before the sun, kneel in the soft loam, and press his fingers into the soil. He did not ask the earth for answers. He did not pray for his son to return. That kind of hope had been buried too long. Instead, he whispered apologies to the wind, to the trees, to the boy he had once carried on his shoulders. The boy who had gone to war, to legend, to silence. It was said that the old king never wept. But the orchard wept for him. The final reveal, Odysseus stood at the edge of the field, silent and still. The sunlight draped across his shoulders like a blessing. Too long withheld, he was home. Yet he remained apart. The man who had crossed oceans and faced monsters now faced a simpler storm, the heartbreak of a father left behind. He watched Laertes from the shadow of the fig trees, watched him dig, prune, and tend with ritual precision. Odysseus had already reclaimed his kingdom, revealed himself to Penelope, embraced his son. But here, in this final corner of his world, he hesitated. He did not know if he would be welcomed or rejected. For grief has its own language, and time rewrites even the faces we love most. So he did not rush forward. He did not shout. He did not proclaim, "Father, it is I." No, Odysseus, the cunning, the wise, approached as a stranger, cloaked not in armor but in patience. He offered small words, a greeting, a question. "Whose orchard is this?" Laertes did not glance up. "It is mine," he answered, voice thin as bark, "but I am only its keeper now." Odysseus nodded. "You have kept it well." That olive tree, the one near the stream, it bends like a mother leaning over her child. And that fig beside the stone, I remember when it was no taller than a man's knee. Laertes stilled. His fingers trembled slightly. These were not things a stranger could know. Only a boy who had run through the orchard barefoot, who had helped plant those very trees. Only a son. Still, Laertes did not look up. "You speak as one who once knew this land." Odysseus stepped closer. The air between them thickened, as though time itself held its breath. "That tree over there," he said, pointing softly, "was planted the day I was born. You called it Ithilien. You told me its roots would grow as deep as my courage. Laertes dropped his trowel. It struck the earth with a muted thud. His eyes lifted slow and wide. The face before him was lined, weathered, different. But the voice was the same. And the name of the tree no one else could have known. Odysseus took another step. "Father," he whispered, "I have come home." In that moment, the orchard bloomed anew, not in flower, but in memory. Hands that once held him Laertes did not rush forward. He simply stood as if the world had stilled, his heart buried so long under layers of sorrow, broke its silence. And then, like a tide that had waited 20 years, he moved. Arms trembling, knees faltering, he reached out and touched his son's face as if to confirm that this was not another dream sent by the gods to torment him. Odysseus let him touch. He did not speak. He only leaned into that hand, weathered and warm, the hand that had once lifted him high above the harvest fields and called him my little lion. "I thought you were gone," Laertes murmured. "I buried you 100 times in my sleep." Odysseus nodded gently. "I was gone. But I am here now." They fell into an embrace not of ceremony, but of soul. Two men, not just father and son, but two branches from the same root, bent by different storms, meeting again under the same sky. Laertes wept, not loud or long, but each tear carved a line down his face, clearing space for peace to return. Odysseus held him tightly, as if to keep him from drifting away again. There was no need for stories. The tales of Troy, the Cyclops, the sirens, they could wait. What mattered now was breath and presence, and the feeling of two hearts beating against one another. The orchard stood around them, silent witnesses to a reunion that no one else would see, and none would forget. The soil beneath their feet was the same soil that had received Laertes' sorrow, and now it cradled joy. For the hands that once held the boy had found the man, and the man had remembered the way home. A seed replanted in the days that followed, the orchard began to change, subtly at first. A new path cleared here, a stone lifted there. Odysseus, though king again, spent each morning beside his father. They did not speak much. There was no need to. Their hands moved in rhythm, planting, tending, mending. One morning, Laertes handed his son a seed. It was small, pale, and smooth. "From the old fig," he said. "The one you climbed when you were 6. Odysseus smiled. "It was taller then." "It's still taller than you," Laertes replied, and they both laughed softly. Together, they planted the seed near the edge of the orchard, a place where the sun lingered longest in the afternoon. They knelt beside each other, pressing earth over memory, bearing sorrow not to forget, but to let it grow into something new. That seed would take root. It would stretch slowly toward the sky, drinking from the same earth that had borne witness to grief and now joy. And one day, perhaps Telemachus would walk these paths with his own son, pointing to the trees and saying, "That one? My grandfather planted it when his father came home." The orchard had seen many seasons of war, of waiting, of withering. But now it would see something else. Renewal. And as the sun dipped low behind the hills of Ithaca, casting the trees in amber and gold, Laertes and Odysseus stood side by side, no longer divided by years or wounds or silence. The orchard, like Ithaca, would grow again, and so would they. Chapter 17. The Sons of the Slain. The sun had only just crested the hills of Ithaca when the cry rose like a thunderclap across the island. A single shout, raw, ragged, soaked in grief, fractured the morning calm, and then others followed. Dozens of voices, then more. Names of sons shouted into the sky. Names that would never again echo through banquet halls or down quiet corridors. The fathers of the suitors had gathered, and they did not come to mourn. They came to kill. These were not timid old men. They were warriors once, commanders, merchants, and lords. Now stripped of their heirs, they gripped swords with shaking, but determined hands, led by the gnawing hollow that grief carves into a man's chest. Revenge had made them young again. In a narrow glade outside the city walls, they stood in a broken circle, not for prayer, but for war. At the center, Eupeithes, father of Antinous, the boldest of the slain suitors, paced like a wolf just before the strike. His cloak was torn, his eyes rimmed red. He held his blade like a verdict. "They slaughtered our sons," he growled. "In our own halls, as if they were thieves." Another voice, brittle and desperate, broke in. "And the king who did it wears no shame." Odysseus sits on his throne again, as though time has erased the blood on his hands. A third voice followed, then a fourth, then all. A chorus of pain twisted into fury. Revenge was no longer a desire. It was a duty. Down the narrow mountain paths they came, cloaks flapping like the wings of dark birds, hearts pounding not with honor, but hunger. Each carried something, a blade, a club, a grief that had turned to rage. They marched toward Ithaca not as a people, but as a storm, and ahead of them stood the gates, the palace. The family who had returned, peace so recently planted, now trembled at the roots. The shield of the goddess, just as the men reached the olive grove, just as the sharp edge of their wrath neared the throne. The wind changed. It did not whistle, it roared. From the sky above, clouds that had once rested like feathers now curled inward, darkening with unnatural speed. There was no warning, no prayer, only presence. Athena came, not as a thought, not as a whisper in the chinema mind, but as a shape carved from storm. Her armor shimmered like wet marble, and her shield pulsed with light too fierce for any mortal eye. She descended into the space between revenge and ruin with the silence of thunder, silent, but deafening. The warriors halted, not because they chose to, but because the air itself had stilled. Their swords hung mid-swing, trapped between impulse and awe. No hand could move when the goddess willed it still. Athena's eyes swept the gathering like cold fire. She saw the fatherless, she saw the fallen, and she saw what might be if anger were allowed to finish what it had begun. "I have watched you," she said, her voice steady as stone. "And I have watched the dead. Vengeance is not justice. It is hunger that consumes the hand that feeds it." Eupeithes stepped forward, chest heaving. "What would you have us do, goddess? Praise the man who took our sons?" Athena did not blink. "I would have you remember that your sons were not guiltless. They mocked the sacred, took what was not theirs, and shed honor like water. Their deaths are not clean, but they are just. If you raise arms now, you raise them not for justice, but for pride." A silence fell. Thick, UNMOVING. Then she raised her shield. From it came no weapon, no flash of war. Instead, light, gentle and wide. It poured over the orchard the road, the swords, the hearts. And within that light, a strange weariness crept into the bones of the angry. Their grief remained, but the fire behind it dimmed. The storm began to dissolve, not with thunder, but with mercy. Words instead of wounds. Into this silence stepped Laertes, not in armor, not with crown, but with the weight of age and truth and time. He walked slowly, leaning on his staff, yet his presence parted the crowd like a wave through wheat. He stood between the people and his son, between the past and what might still be saved. I have lost as well, he said, his voice dry as parchment but clear as dawn. I lost my son to war, to sea, to silence. For 20 years I did not know whether he breathed. He turned, eyes glistening. And now he has returned, not with boast, but with burden. The men listened, not because they had been commanded, but because his sorrow mirrored their own. Laertes motioned behind him. Telemachus stepped forward, young, steady, eyes firm. He looked not like a boy of feasts, but a man forged in fire. We grieve with you, he said softly. But your sons were not innocent. They sought to divide what was not theirs. They disrespected my mother, threatened my home, and tried to carve a future that did not belong to them. And yet, he added, we do not meet you today with blades drawn. We are here, without armor, without hate. Finally, Odysseus stepped beside his son. For the first time since his return, he laid down his sword, not dropped, not tossed, but placed, with intention, on the ground. The steel touched earth with a sound that rang like a closing door. Odysseus looked out at the fathers, at the old friends, now nearly enemies, at the faces that had once welcomed him from war. No more blood, he said. Not for this. Let the sea bury what the war left behind. And for a long moment, a breath held by the gods themselves, no one moved. Then, slowly, hands released hilts. Swords were lowered, and the storm passed. A kingdom reforged, there were no trumpets. Number. Declarations carved in stone. But from that day forward, Ithaca changed. The streets began to hum again with soft footsteps. Markets opened earlier, and mothers sent their sons to gather bread without fear. Farmers returned to their fields, fishermen to their nets. The sky seemed wider somehow, as if it too had been released. Odysseus did not rule as before. He did not need to. He listened more than he spoke. He walked among his people with the quiet humility of one who had lost much and still returned. Laertes remained in the orchard, but his hands no longer trembled with grief. They planted, they pruned, and when Telemachus visited, he listened to stories that stretched back through generations, like roots under old soil. And as for the fathers who had once come with fire, in their hearts many planted trees for their sons, not monuments of stone, but living things that would rise with time. Not war. Athena, though unseen, remained. Her presence lingered in the wind, in the rustle of the olive leaves, in the silence that now stretched between sunrise and dusk. Without fear. Peace had come. Not through conquest, not by force, but by choice. And though it was fragile, like all things human, it was real. For the first time in years, Ithaca exhaled. And in that breath, the gods smiled. Chapter 18. The Hero Who Returned. The sky above Ithaca was soft that morning, colored with a hush of dawn before the wind began to stir the olive trees. Along a narrow path, edged with wild thyme and low stone walls, a man walked alone. His steps were neither hurried nor heavy. He walked like one who had learned that there is no reason to race toward anything, not now. Not anymore. This was Odysseus, but not the man who had sailed from this land so many years before. Not the warrior flushed with glory, or the king whose words bent the will of men. This was the quiet king, not less than he had been, but more. Softly shaped, weathered by time, smoothed by sorrow. There were no trumpets, no dancers, no garlands flung in joy. No crowds waited at every bend to praise him. Yet as he passed, the land itself seemed to stir. The trees rustled gently. The stones seemed to hum with memory. He was known here, not by the noise of celebration, but by the silence of recognition. He stopped by an old fig tree. Its bark was marked with a small scar, carved long ago by a boy who had once dreamed of growing taller than its branches. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds more remembering than joy. His fingers traced the mark, now faded with time, and in that simple motion, 1,000 years of story seemed to pass. Down in the fields, farmers lifted their eyes. Some whispered his name, others simply nodded. They had not always believed he would return. Some had said the sea took him, others the war. But now, here he was, not shining like a god, but walking like a man. And that, somehow, was the greater miracle. He made his way through the hills, where shepherds herded flocks in the early light, past a stream where he had once taught Telemachus to fish. Every step brought him closer, not just to his home, but to the memory of who he had once been and the realization of who he had become. Odysseus did not need a crown to be king. Not here. The island knew. The stones remembered. The silence welcomed him. The lessons of the sea. There are places on the sea where no star guides you. Only darkness. Only wind. And it is there that a man discovers what he truly carries, not in his hands, but in his soul. Odysseus had learned this many times. He had fought wars not only with swords, but with storms. Had battled not only monsters, but the ache of longing. The sea had stripped him bare, not to destroy, but to teach. Now, as he stood near the shore, watching the waves rise and fall, he did not see them as obstacles. He saw them as mirrors, each crest a memory, each fall a surrender. He thought of the men he had lost. Their faces still flickered in his dreams. Elpenor, who fell from a roof and never saw the sun again. Anticlea, his mother, whom he met in shadow. The companions who had eaten the cattle of the sun and paid for it with their lives. He thought of Calypso, who offered him immortality, and how he had turned away. Not for pride, but because immortality without home is not a gift. It is a prison. And Circe, who turned men into beasts, and taught him that not all monsters wear fangs. Some, like grief and regret, wear the face of love. He remembered the ache of hearing Penelope's name in the wind, whispered by no one. The 1,000 choices he had made when he could have given up, and the 1,000 more he would have to live with. But through all of it, the sea had given him one thing more precious than glory. It had given him wisdom, not the kind sung by poets, or etched in stone, but the quiet kind. The kind you carry in your chest like a warm coal long after the fire has gone. He brought it back with him now, not as a weapon, but as a seed, for a kingdom does not grow from strength alone. It grows from understanding, from humility, from the kind of pain that shapes gentleness, and the kind of love that waits without end. Home, at last the gates of the palace stood open, not wide, but enough. A quiet invitation, not a triumphal arch. Odysseus stepped through slowly, the cool stone beneath his feet grounding him in the now. Inside, Penelope waited, not draped in gold or royal cloth, but in a simple robe, her hands folded softly in her lap. She did not rise when she saw him. She did not run. She only looked long and deep into the eyes of the man who had lived 1,000 lives since she last held him. He stepped closer, and in that short distance, 2 decades folded like paper. No words were needed. He knelt before her, not as king to queen, but as husband to wife, as soul to soul. And she lifted his face gently, cradling it with hands that had held both a loom and a kingdom together. Telemachus stood near the door, watching his father with quiet reverence. He did not interrupt. He simply nodded, as if confirming to the gods and to himself that yes, this was truly home. Servants moved like shadows, placing water, bread, and wine. Not a feast, just a meal. But in that moment, it was more sacred than any banquet. Outside, the people of Ithaca began to gather. Some came hesitantly, unsure if they were welcome. Others brought gifts: olive oil, figs, bits of cloth woven in the old way. No one cheered, but one by one they knelt. Not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood the hero had returned, not to rule, but to belong. And as the sun dipped low, casting the courtyard in golden light, Odysseus stood among his people, not above them. Among them, home at last. A story that never ends. The fire crackled gently in the hearth. Outside, the stars blinked open one by one, scattered across the sky like seeds of memory. Odysseus sat beneath the great olive tree in the courtyard, its branches curling like an old hand over his head. He was not speaking to anyone, and yet the silence around him was listening. The Odyssey was ending, the journey complete, but stories, like rivers, do not stop. They change direction. They flow into new lands. He looked out over the sea, dark and endless. Somewhere out there, another ship might be sailing. Another soul caught between home and the unknown. He smiled softly. Some would remember him as the man who built the horse at Troy. Others, as the wanderer who faced the Cyclops, the sorceress, the underworld. But he knew that the truest part of his journey was not in the monsters he defeated, but in the man he became. The boy who had once chased glory had returned as something better. A husband, a father, a king, yes. But more than that, a man who understood the cost of coming home. His story would be sung, passed down by poets and grandfathers, but not just for the battles, not just for the tricks. For the truth, it whispered, that every soul who leaves must find their way back, that the hardest part of any journey is not surviving the storm, but standing still and saying, I am here, I am changed, but I have returned. In the years to come, children would sit beneath this tree and listen, eyes wide, heads tilted, imagining monsters and gods. But in their hearts, they would carry something deeper, the quiet echo of a man who walked a long road and found, in the end, that the truest adventure was home.